Hey guys, this is miicrow. We're going to be talking about what is best to run for your jewelry setup at this up and coming patch, as well as talk about uh, the actual kind of cheap best in slot items that you can slot for jewelry, which will be helpful if you want to try to save some gold there. And lastly, firstly here, I want to review like the actual damage formula for New World because I keep getting questions about this, and I feel like it's very confusing and unintuitive, but it's very important to understand in terms of optimizing your damage, which is important for every single game mode. So like start off here, base. So damage in New World is calculated from base damage, which is an internal kind of modifier, not the actual weapon damage that it says on your weapon itself. This is like a separate bonus that applies to that value. Uh, there's also like a crit thing involved with that, but that doesn't affect the base damage cap. There's armor, and then there's empower. There's ABS internally, as we like to call it around here, Old Fortify, because this is a bucket that Old Fortify was in that some stuff is still in, some stuff's being added into, but it's overall a little bit more rare. And all of these are important. If you want to maximize your damage, you want to spread your points equally in all of these, and the reason why is because it effectively compounds. So if I have, say I have 1.4 as my total bonus points that I can spend, if I do 1.1 times 1.1 times 1.1 times 1.1, I'm going to get a number that is bigger than 1.4, so it makes more sense to spread them out in terms of dealing damage. But if you're trying to reduce damage, it is more beneficial to put all your resources into one bucket in order to reduce the values that are for everything else. So the main reason why this comes into a play is because base damage is very, very common in New World, so the best way to actually mitigate damage is to stack weaken-based effects, which the flail is going to be stacking weaken, as well as old fortify-based effects, which the flail is also doing that, SNS is doing that, SNS also applies weaken, so basically, if you're weakened, or if the other team has old fortify, you're just not going to be doing damage, so you need to find a way to mitigate that in order to do damage. So, for example, if a healer has 50% thrust ward, you probably want to slot an elemental gem in your bow to try to navigate around that. But you have to know that they have that thrust ward first to kind of start navigating around that. But that's the base idea for how to maximize your damage. In terms of like what is actually in what category, base damage contains things like armor class. Your gems in your actual weapon, that's supposed to be a W. It doesn't really look like a W. Uh, Sorry, I'm drawing on top of the screen with a pen. It's kind of hard. Attunement, most damage-based effects, aversion, ward. This is the new ward, enchanted ward, and grit ward. Armor, stuff like rend, fortify. Pretty self-explanatory. Anything that has a rend or a fortify will be doing this effect. Empowers anything that contains the word empower or anything that contains like a weaken. So keenly empowered, that's the source of empower. A weaken is also pretty obvious because it will say it weakens. And then old fortify is very hard to figure out. This is something you kind of have to look at the back end for, but sword and shield has it, flail has it, gems have it, and then elemental pots also have it, and those are the main sources of old fortify. So those are the things that you kind of need to be aware of in terms of increasing and kind of decreasing your damage overall. If you want to increase, go in as many buckets as you can. If you want to decrease, go into one bucket ideally. In terms of like how strong they are, as from a power level perspective, old fortify is generally the best thing, and power is like the next strongest thing, then base damage, then armor. I think some people have this flip-flopped and think base damage is more important than empower, but the reason why I say empower is more important than base damage is because empower can be influenced more by a defender standpoint, so it makes sense to usually go over the empower cap with your build, so that if you get weakened by the defenders, you'll still do decent damage, versus if you don't go over empower cap, or if you don't use empower at all, the weak ones will severely mitigate the damage on your build. In terms of like the actual cap for these builds, base damage is plus or minus 100. Armor is -70 to 200. Like scaling wise off Rend and Fort. Empower is plus or minus 50, and then old fortify, it goes up to plus 50. There's nothing beyond that, and you can't go negative anymore because there's no source of negative fortify except for great sword, which is in a different bucket, so it will never hit that cap, so you never really have to worry about that. But that's like kind of a niche thing. But overall, and then for the great sword, it's just the stances that do that, and it's nothing else. Nothing else in the game applies like that. But overall, if you want to do your damage next patch, try to get into this empower bucket as much as you can. Try to not be affected by the other team's gem slots as much as you can, and then after that, I'd start looking at base damage and trying to up that. But just know that most classes are actually capping on this, which is kind of important. So you don't really need to think about the base damage too much, or at least most damage-oriented classes are. So Abyss Great Axe is going to cap on that. Fire Staff is going to cap on that. Blunderbuss is going to cap on base damage. Like a lot of classes that are doing damage are going to cap on that, so it's actually more important for your build overall to start focusing on this Empower bucket, whether that means switching your gem setup so you include Jasper, which is kind of sketchy, or running something like Shrinking Empower or the Tumbler Shoes to increase that. But anyways, with that diversion out of the way, let's get into the main juicy part of the video here and get rid of this. So I want to talk about like jewelry in terms of what is actually BIS. Uh, as a start here, you can craft your own jewelry, or you can get jewelry that is dropping naturally in the world, and then you can change the last perk on that using a new consume that they're adding, along with, I believe it's dark, what's it called? It's like dark matter, I believe, is what it's called. But you could use dark matter to change it along with this new consume. Dark matter can be obtained from salvaging gear, so you get the idea. You gain gear, you salvage the gear that you don't like, use that stuff that you don't like to kind of create better gear and go from there. In terms of like what we have available to us on the amulet, it is honestly very cut in stone with the amulet, and I'm very upset they didn't nerf the amulet, or they didn't like change it more. They did nerf health, but health is still like a very, very good perk to go onto amulet. There's no reason to never to ever not run that. Stam recovery, I know this is hard to believe from a New World standpoint. If you played New World at any point in the history of New World, if you didn't play since the beginning of the game, you probably knew that stam recovery was very good. That got buffed, and that like needs a very, very serious nerf. Like if stam recovery got nerfed to like a 60-second to 90-second cooldown, it would still probably be played with every single class, because it is just better than Purify. It's better than reducing all your cooldowns, although you could take that perk with stam recovery too. It's better than any of those kind of conditional based effects, yet it's still going to be mandated. There are some ways to like work around this if you're newer to PvP, or when PvE it's not really as important. But if you're newer to that PvP in setting, if someone is below half HP, stam recovery will never proc unless they get healed above half HP, so those are generally good people to focus down. So that's the idea of focusing your fire on people that are below half HP, because their stam recovery won't proc. That's like something very simple that's very helpful for securing kills in terms of OPRs, wars, 3v3s, 1v1s, etc. 1v1s you won't take advantage of as much, it's more target switching oriented. But anyways, health, stam recovery, both very, very good effects. In terms of your last effect, the most common thing for next patch, to be honest, from how it's looking, is looking like void protection, because this is 15% less void damage. This is old fortify, so it's super, super effective. That's the highest priority thing that you can capitalize on in terms of buckets. And then the next thing I think is decent for some classes is divine, but this requires that you're getting healed a lot, and I think is generally not worth it for most classes. If you're on point, I think divine is somewhat of a consideration, but to be honest, the void protection is going to be better in like 95% of cases. If you're not doing PvE and you're doing PvE, you will want the protection that correlates with the dungeon mutator modifier that will kind of reduce the damage of that dungeon. So if your strategy for going from a PvE build is maybe you get health, you get stam recovery, and then you change this last perk, that would be one option depending on the week. Kind of more expensive, to be honest, or you can just get uh, a gem set up for every single kind of possible thing. So you get a fire one, get a frozen one, get a void one, get an arcane one. I don't think there's an arcane week actually, but there's a nature week. Like you get the idea there. Like you try to get them towards the actual ward that you need, so you can max out on that old fortify and not have to worry as much about other things. In terms of like ones that are decent, like budget BIS, there's this life ring amulet that can be obtained. It's dropped by a few angry earth related mobs. It has health and divine for the last perk on here. You can throw in stam recovery, and that's like a pretty decent budget amulet. It's noteworthy it has magnify, so if you're not going a complete split build, or if you don't have a large disparity between your stats, this might not be usable for you. What I mean by that is typically if you use 3 artifacts, you're going to have 102 magnify. If you're even split with this next patch, so I guess there's like 2 paths here. If you're, let me do the G again. If you're even split, this will be fine because it will just go down both paths. So this is like if I run 300 focus, 300 con kind of thing, like I'm a healer, then this is perfectly fine. But say I'm a healer and I don't run 300 focus, I don't run 300 con. Instead, I run 350 focus. Uh, and then I run 250 con. Like this is not going to consistently be usable because you need to have 102 magnify disparity if you're using 3 artifacts, or if you use additional pieces with magnify. So typically magnify is a detriment to have on your gear piece as much as they tried to make it a benefit. So it's noteworthy that while you can get some of these budget options, they're often not worth it long term and are instead, I would argue, a short term thing that you can go for the expansion, and then like early on just run like a 300 split with no matter what build you do, and don't worry about the magnify until you have that other best in class gear available to you at a more cheap price than will be there the first couple weeks of the expansion. There's also this pretty good amulet called Acorn, which is focus, that I think is decent for any kind of life staff player, but again it has divine on here. So you won't have stam recovery, which kind of sucks. You'll only be able to replace your last perk on here with stam recovery, so it's like not ideal, but again, kind of a budget-based option. Moving on to rings, because amulets are kind of cut and dry. Rings are a lot more fun this up and coming patch. I believe Ring has Healing Breeze added, which is like a 20% weapon-based heal that lasts for 6 seconds and has a 10-second cooldown. Very, very good on healer builds. Very, very good for any build that runs Shirking Heals because it procs off of that for some reason, and that's just overall a good perk. We won't see that and on this piece for some reason. I don't see the healing breeze. Oh no, it's right here. Okay, no, we're fine. Yeah, but healing breeze heals for 20% weapon damage for 6 seconds. Takes a vial of water. It's just like generally a good perk to go. But there's other decent perks here. I think the question that some people are gonna have is invig good still? Uh, my hard answer is hell no. The reason why it's not good anymore is because like every build that wants to run invig is already at base damage cap, basically, except for Bruiser. And then even for Bruiser, if say it's still good for you, say you're not at base damage cap, this is only going to be 1 to 10%, and then it's also only supposed to proc off non-forts. This is something that they talked about before the latest change to Invig, so it's potential that they just couldn't make it so it didn't apply to Fortify, and they just lowered the value so that Fortify would not be a debuff anymore if you were applying that, which is a funny case in light that we discovered months ago. But assuming that they are gonna do that change and like make it do it successfully because they said they would, and they're gonna do it this expansion like 2 or 3 months ago, it's not going to be very, very good overall because there's not enough things that will proc this effect. I think on average, you'll have around a 5-ish percent base damage increase, which is not a 5% damage increase. That's like not a very significant amount. This is like maybe I'd say it's closer to like 2 to 3% uh, damage increase. So it's just like not very, very good. So I would not focus on Invig, instead focus on like other better perks to run. In terms of what you have to run Hardy for 90% of builds in this game. For medium, arguable that you don't have to run Hardy, so that one you can get a little bit more creative on. One that I think is personally really good for certain builds that charge ult a lot is Purifying Heart, because this is a cleanse pot every time you pop your heart rune. Cleanse is very, very nice, and especially for modes that have a lot of dot effects. So like if you're playing OPR, you probably noticed if you played OPR into PTR, there were a lot of random dot effects. This would cleanse all of them every time you popped your heart rune. So it's like a super, super nice kind of get out of jail free card for certain classes. So I think that is a really good perk. Uh, and then lastly, kind of have some choice here. Healing Breeze and Leeching, I think, are both really good. Healing Breeze is obviously more defensive. Leeching is decent. You could also go for Keen Awareness, but this is damage. And realistically, I don't think most builds are going to go for these, though, and instead they're going to go for a damage perk because the damage perks got buffed. So if you're like a Bruiser, for example, maybe you want Purifying Heart, maybe you want Leeching, kind of as your preference there, but you're going to go a slash damage Hardy for most builds. If you're medium, you can drop that maybe. Maybe you want Purifying Heart and Leeching, or you want Purifying Heart and Healing Breeze, or something like that. Like you can kind of get crazy with it, but the idea here is you pretty much always want your damage perk if you're a damage class. Purifying Heart is probably going to be pretty good because it will get rid of Rens, it will help you live longer, it will get rid of dots, which will help you live longer, and it's just like overall a very good perk. It's like having an ice gauntlet. base effect on any weapon that you play, which is really nice. Like from a bruiser perspective, you don't really want to go into a clump on your weekend, and this would be a like with a detonate, and this would be a way to kind of help mitigate that. So I'd recommend Purifying Heart for most builds, but it's not by all means a must-have perk. In terms of some like name drops that are basically best in slot, Bruiser has a best in slot item for most players. If you're medium, some people still like to run Hardy. It lets you get an extra dodge sometimes if you space out your stamina correctly and you don't actually gray bar. Slash damage on here, very, very good. Hardy, awesome. Last perk, do whatever you want. Doesn't have magnify, checks all the boxes. Privateer's hair rooms, very, very good. This drops from an angry earth mob called Nereid. So find that mob, kill the mob, get your BIS ring like pretty easily next patch. In terms of other rings, you got a leeching hardy one with magnify here that drops all over Imperial and a few other places in Brim. That it looks decent. There's a Zloth crystal ring, which is basically the same thing, but instead drops in mutations, which is probably a little bit easier to get. So hardy leeching, very, very good for PvE, PvP. It still seems like it's perfectly viable. There's a Starstone ring, which the last two perks, I feel like this is bugged to a certain degree on here because you shouldn't be able to get 4 perks and a gem slot. But if you can, this is going to be the best ring in the game, but I don't think you're going to be able to. It's probably going to be 3 perks, but this has fire damage and refreshing on there, which is nice for certain builds like Fire Staff. Just slap on the Hardy, good to go. Just like a decent ring out of the box. And then lastly, for any support build, Blood Drinker seemed like it was pretty good because the minus 25 damage is actually a base damage bonus, and you tended to have a decent amount of base damage inherent to most classes. So we weren't actually losing 25% damage. This was closer to losing about 15-ish percent damage, a little bit less for higher base damage classes, a little bit more for classes that don't have so much base damage. So if you're a heavy SNS, you're actually going to lose about 25% damage. But if you're a blunderbuss, you're going to be losing about like 12.5%. So ballpark 15-ish percent damage loss for this. But in return, you heal off every single dot effect, which is really, really strong. And you heal off AoEs, which other leeching does not. It will be interesting to see if they fix that or not, but it seemed like it was somewhat intended as a natural consequence for you losing your damage, since you could heal for more than a typical effect. Because you would think that if they were able to code leeching to work this way, they would be able to make Ghoul's Harmony work like leeching. It's not very different. Moving on to earrings here, we got the Mithril earring. Earrings have a lot of interesting perks, actually. I think they went from like the weakest perk slot item into like one of the stronger ones, surprisingly. The main thing for earrings though is Refreshing Toast got heavily nerfed. If we look at Refreshing Toast got nerfed from 25% to 10%, and I don't think that's very usable for most builds anymore. In addition to that, your pot effectiveness got decreased, so there's an argument to run the artifact, which I have in right here, the Endless Thirst, which will increase how much you're healed from, but the cooldown's going to increase. If you're a person that doesn't use pots all the time, this is a really good artifact for you to run. It will actually make your pots heal like they're on the current patch. With the next patch, which they're just getting nerfed by 30% in PvP, 20% overall, I believe. So just a decent artifact to go for if you're missing something. You can get this on the reward track, I believe, at level 100 on the free version, not the paid one, so not completely pay to win there, but you can buy levels if you want to speed up progress, but I think it's kind of a stupid waste of money personally, and I think most people would agree on that. There's leveling guides to do that in like probably 2 to 3 hours per expansion instead of having to spend like however much money it takes. But Healing Heart, I think this is decent because a lot of people have an increase in HP. Most builds, it seemed like they're around 2 point, or not 2.3, 23k-ish HP was like pretty common. For next patch, we're running like a bunch of healing based effects. So this would be a 2.3k heal every time you use your heart rune. Decent effect. I won't say it's perfect, but it's like a decent way to heal. So something that I'm going to be looking for a couple builds, but not always best in slot. Regenerating, decent perk, 50 or 0.52%, right? So say we have 23k HP, same thing. Multiply that by 0.0052. We're going to be healing for 120 HP per second. Not a lot, but adds up. A decent, well, very good perk for OPR, first of all. A good perk for 1v1s, good perk for 3v3s, but a bigger scale tends to fall off a little bit. Some people prefer Nimble. Nimble is still 10% stam regenerate, so it's not great, but it can make a difference at times. So for certain people, I think nimble will still be worth it. For certain people that like regenerating will still be worth it, but kind of a preference there. Refreshing seems like it's a decent choice because refreshing had its effectiveness basically buffed and or doubled. So I'd argue refreshing is like one of the stronger perks that you can go for this build. Regenerating or nimble, depending on your preference, there will be a decent perk. And then on your last perk slot, you kind of have preference, I would argue. Fortifying toast, I think makes more sense than empowering toast because typically if you're popping a pot, it's before or it's like after you took damage or before you're about to go in a clump and you don't want to take damage. If you're a person that likes to pop a pot before they do damage, which I think is kind of weird combo wise, then empowering toast might be for you. It's only a 10% in power though, but a 10% power and a 20% fortify are actually about the same in terms of a power level. Fortify is typically worth about half the value it says on there in terms of mitigation for medium and heavy classes. If you're a light class, fortifying toast will not be very useful for you because the fortify effect for light players is worth about a third of the value that it says here. So it won't be super useful for you if you're a light player. You might get more value out of healing heart, for example. You might get more value out of refreshing toast if you don't like to pop a lot, or you can just use the artifact itself. In any case, earrings seem like very, very flexible. I'd argue that regenerating and refreshing are the two best perks for this upcoming patch, and that third perk's kind of a whatever you feel like slotting slot. Artifact, again, very good if you don't pop pots a lot. I didn't bring up the Amulet artifact in here because one of them's bugged. It's supposed to be a super divine, so it could be good for certain builds for the Amulet, and the other one extends stun durations, which I think is good for cheese builds, but not any other build. Which was kind of weird why they would put that in the game if they don't like cheese builds, and then they added an artifact that would double the stun duration. But anyways, earring, very, very solid. In terms of not popping pots a lot. Empowering toast, fortifying toast, I think independently are decent. If you could have them together with this, it's just normally illegal. I'd say this is good for medium and heavy builds exclusively. Uh, that's not how you make a E, but you get the idea. Medium and heavy builds, this is a decent perk because the fortify will actually get value. I think particularly medium builds, like a medium bruiser, this could be okay, but you have to not pop your pot off cooldown, which the problem is this is not viable in wars because this would increase the duration between pops of your cleanse pot, and that's just a hard no-go in a war situation. Like you want to have your cleanse pot up as much as possible. You're not going to want to make that so it doesn't come up 20% faster. It's like a really big nerf from a war standpoint. But OPR, open world, etc., like decent amulet to go for. In terms of actual rings, all of these seem to have trade-offs to some degree. So there's a Garden of Genesis one, so this has regenerating and healing heart. Both decent perks, but int dex, not ideal. We have another healing heart one, Damien Boar. Uh, int con, a lot better. Purifying toast, decent. Encroaching corruption earring. Healing heart nimble. If you're a nimble kind of person. And this last one is magnify with healing heart and regenerating. We could see if there is one in terms of earrings that has like refreshing on here. But I didn't see any that like looked super insane. Assuming that they uh, increase the effectiveness of the PvP reward track, there might be a couple, but was not seeing a lot of decent ones in terms of earrings here. So this is like refreshing toast, right? So this is old BIS, but I don't think refreshing toast is very good anymore. Refreshing nimble, this is pretty good for tight earring. Charcoal fortifying toast refreshing, this is something I'd probably be looking for more so. Plundered hoop, decent, but again not insane. And then these last couple are more specialty ones, like you're never going to run that one in PvP. Nimble refreshing healthy toast, decent for a healer kind of base setup. And then regenerating, refreshing Healthy Toast. But you got to keep in mind that Healthy Toast was nerfed in terms of its healing because Potion Healing got nerfed by effectively 30%. So it's just not a very good heal anymore. But it is another, if you are popping mana pots, like it's not a bad thing to go for by any means. With that being said, let me know what you guys think in terms of like perks overall. But all of them seem decent in terms of jewelry. I would say Amulet, very stuck in stone in terms of what you want. You always want your health, you want your stam. And then probably avoid protection, to be honest. So this is Amulet. Your ring, you probably want Hardy. And then you want your damage perk for most builds. Not all builds want a damage perk. And then I would argue the cleansing effect is like pretty good, but the leeching effect also got buffed, so I think that's decent. I don't think that Invig is really worth it with this upcoming patch personally. Earring, Refreshing, generally good because that value got double the effectiveness, and the perks still aren't insane, but they're better. And then you don't want refreshing toast anymore. Fortifying toast seems okay. I don't think earring is like super set in stone. No, this is all kind of play it by ear, whatever you like. Regenerating seems good. Slash nimble, like you can kind of go with whatever you want there. There's also the healing heart here that is decent as well. I don't think there are any perks are really in the tier list of their own though, besides like hardy, damage, and stam. Like those are all kind of mandatory. Everything and health is pretty much mandatory. Everything else is like more preference, whatever you want to do. And you can kind of have fun with it depending on what game mode you're playing. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you in the next video.